Hey everyone, welcome back to Build. I'm your host, Brittany Jones-Cooper. In 2014, 276 Nigerian schoolgirls were kidnapped from a school in Chibok, Nigeria, and hidden in the vast Sambisa forest for 3 years by Boko Haram, a violent Islamic insurgent movement. In 2017, 82 girls were released, and a documentary crew followed them as they attempted to readjust to life after their traumatic imprisonment. The film Stolen Daughters Kidnapped by Boko Haram tells their story and chronicles emotional reunions with family members. Let's take a look.
They told us that they're here to protect us.
They are not soldiers, they are Boko Haram.
The moment Obama carried that placard, boom, everyone was talking about the Chibok girls.
Gaskiya wannan ranan da duk lokacin da na tuna.
Kawai tafiya ne.
Abin da na ji da abin da na gani.
Cewa anya wannan ni ne na fita daga cikin wannan wahala.
The latest about negotiation for the release of the
Still going on.
Yanci dai yanayin da na gane yanci da ke ki samu da yardan Allah.
Everyone, please put your hands together for producer Sasha Achilli.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Thank you for being here, and thank you for putting some time and effort into this documentary. I think it's, people know the phrase Boko Haram. I feel like very few people really either wanted to or took the time to really understand what happened. So can you take us back to that day in 2014 and just sort of sum up what happened to these girls?
Well, so actually Boko Haram was very active in northeast Nigeria since 2009, perpetrating acts of violence. But in 2014 it was a particularly violent year, and in April of 2014 they kidnapped the Chibok girls from their boarding school. It was at night, and they were there taking their final year exams, and they were told, they heard the cars coming, and these men showed up and they said that they were soldiers, and then soon after they realized that they weren't soldiers, that they were actually Boko Haram. But previously to the Chibok girls being kidnapped, a lot of children had been kidnapped and actually killed. Often they would raid schools and burn the school down. And that was happening way before these girls were kidnapped. And it kept happening after these girls were kidnapped.
So what exactly is the mission of Boko Haram?
Well, that's a very complicated question, right? So Boko Haram means Western education is forbidden in Hausa, and they, like a lot of violent extremist groups, they want to set up a caliphate, an Islamic caliphate up in the northeast of Nigeria. The northeast of Nigeria is predominantly Muslim. And back in the 1800s, there was a caliphate there. Boko Haram actually started as a youth movement. So it became violent out of anger towards the establishment, towards governance, and lack of governance basically led to radicalization. And so they basically want to take over the Northeast. That would be the simple way to put it, and create a caliphate.
The women who are abducted, and it's not just these girls. I mean, like, there's thousands of women and children and young boys in captivity that they're using to build this caliphate. So what are some of the things that they're expected to do once they're kidnapped?
Well, so there are, as you mentioned, thousands of girls, but also boys. So often the boys are kidnapped and used as child soldiers or soldiers. So boys and men have disappeared and been kidnapped or killed. And the girls, the role of the girls is either to become wives, and if they don't become wives, they're often used as slaves, and that's how they operate in the area, and so they've built up like makeshift towns, and so they need to function as that, and so the girls are used, as wives, as child rearers and slaves.
So the Nigerian government received a lot of flack for this story. Once it kind of started gaining global attention, a lot of people were like, well, why don't they just go in and take these girls out? But it's more complicated than that.
Yeah, so what happened when these girls were kidnapped, it was the previous administration, Goodluck Jonathan, and it actually took a while for the government to acknowledge that these girls had been kidnapped. Actually, they were in denial. They thought it was a hoax. They thought it was a conspiracy from leaders of the Northeast to overthrow the government, the Goodluck Jonathan government, which, you know, he was from the South, so there's tension between the North and the South and the politics. So it took a while for them to acknowledge that this actually had happened. And if it hadn't been for the parents of the Chibok girls, who very early on stormed the town, protested outside of the town council, and the news spread, reached Abuja, and then there was an extraordinary group of women, including Obi Ezekwesili, who's actually now running for president. Awesome woman. It was this group of women who then started creating the Bring Back Our Girls campaign, and the word spread. And so then the government couldn't deny that, you know, that this had actually happened. And weird things happened in the few days after this occurred, where, you know, the government was like, oh, we've rescued them. But actually they hadn't. So there were lies.
It seems like they were really trying to contain the story, create their own narrative. So how were you guys able to get access to these girls? Because it seemed like they really wanted to control the messaging that came out of the situation.
So when I first went out to Nigeria, it was November 2016, and it was just a few weeks after the government had finally managed to negotiate the release of 21 girls. And so when I started having these meetings with Department of State Security, who was in charge of the girls, I think they were in a position where they felt like they'd achieved something, and they were proud, you know, and they were like, oh, well, and you know, I have to say that I think because I was a Westerner, because I was saying, you know, it's HBO, and the West is interested, I think that's why they also listened to me, and they opened the door, and I started being able to have these meetings and discuss, you know, the possibility of filming with the girls. But, you know, by the time we actually started filming with the girls, another 82 girls had been released. So I think they were willing to kind of say, hey, like, yeah, it took us 3 years, but you know, and now it was a different administration. So the president, Buhari, part of his campaign was that he could rescue these girls. So, you know, they wanted to show that they had achieved, they hadn't rescued all of them, but they started.
But you still had some restraints in how you could cover the story, right?
Yeah, so I, you know, again, several meetings with government officials, and then I had a meeting with the Minister of Women's Affairs, who is briefly in our film, a very strong woman who looked at me, and she was like, okay, but if we let you in, you can't talk to them about what happened in the forest. And I asked her why. And she said, you know, she framed it as, you know, we don't want to re-traumatize them. We don't want them to go back to that space. If you're asking them questions, we'll re-traumatize them. And, you know, there is a truth to that in a way. You know, the 82 girls, when we started filming, had only been released like 6 weeks before, 2 weeks. So it was fresh, you know. And so for her, it was about safeguarding the girls. And I think that it was also shrouded slightly in the fact that, you know, there's a lot of shame. The government feels a lot of shame that it took so long to release, to get them out. And they, you know, still today sustain that, you know, the girls weren't actually harmed, that they weren't, you know, raped. So they were trying to control the narrative in that sense.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, of course, when you sit down and watch this film, the first thing you want to know is what happened in that forest.
Yeah.
But I love that the film was able to find other survivors, other people who escaped their captivity, and they were open and willing to share their stories. So how did you go about finding those people?
So actually, you know, the negotiation to film with the Chibok girls took a long time. So I started traveling to the northeast of Nigeria, to Maiduguri, which has become kind of the heartland of the fight against Boko Haram. And it's now where, you know, inundated by refugees. It's a massive internally displaced population. And so there are so many girls, so many children who are either living in the refugee camps or in the host communities. All of them with these horrific stories, and they're easier to reach because they're just living in the community. And I got in touch with an amazing organization, Nigerian organization called Neem Foundation, and spent quite a bit of time with them. And they provide psychological support for girls in the communities. So I was going with them and meeting some of these girls. And they were, you know, in a position where they could talk about what happened. And so in the film, when you'll see it, there's a balance, you know, there's the story of the Chibok girls who can't really speak about what happened to them, but then I hope that by telling the story of the forgotten girls, the audience can kind of fill the gaps, you know.
You say forgotten girls, that's what they call all of these women who somehow managed to get out of the forest. And they're living, and you would think, oh, they would be welcomed back with open arms. Oh, you've survived this horrible trauma. But many of them have all of these obstacles in re-entering their communities. Why?
Well, so there's a lot of fear that some of the women who have escaped Boko Haram are actually part of Boko Haram. So the communities in Maiduguri who live there feel a lot of fear. There is, you know, Boko Haram uses women as suicide bombers and strap them up with vests and send them into the city to blow themselves up. So there's a lot of mistrust in Maiduguri, and you know, I felt that as well. Like, as soon as you're surrounded by children, you have to get out because you just don't know who's who, so who the threat is. And so there is a fear towards these girls that they might be radicalized. And then, you know, there's stigma. Some of the girls leave the forest with babies, so they've clearly been raped. The babies are Boko Haram babies. And so there's a lot of stigma placed, you know, like in a lot of places in the world where women who have been raped, there's a lot of shame in that, you know, and especially in a place like in northeast Nigeria.
I walked away just feeling like women go through so much, you know, even when you are able to survive a situation, and we see this even in our own country, you are somehow vilified or, you know, meant to keep fighting.
Yeah, look at the Me Too movement.
Exactly.
For example.
Yeah. For you, being a part of this journey, what was maybe the most difficult sort of part, either in gathering the information or just personal experiences you had on the ground?
I think operating in Nigeria is not easy. It has a whole different way of working. Time is relative. Navigating the government and who I needed to talk to and all those meetings. But aside from that, I think having met and spent time with the two forgotten girls in the film, especially Habiba, was an incredible privilege, because she is one of the bravest women I have ever met. You know, at the age of 18, to have, I don't want to give spoilers, but to have done what she did, suffered what she had, and still has this like incredible empathy and stoicism to be able to take care of these two little boys she rescued. And from like a personal point of view, when again, spoilers, you know, I went, I don't want to give spoilers, so I won't, but you know, I was very close to her when she became ill, and that was really difficult because I felt powerless. I was back in the UK at that point. I was trying to call my contacts, you know, Doctors Without Borders and UNICEF to try and help, but it was too late.
How much assistance is there? Because even in that city you mentioned where a lot of the refugees are, there's not a ton of resources, and people are sort of left. And is there any? And even the Boko Haram men will come back and stay with their family there. So there's a lot of people who are complicit to it.
Yeah, I mean, again, as I mentioned, Boko Haram started as a youth group, so they all kind of grew up in Maiduguri, in that region. So that's where their homes are. The help started coming. I think the brilliance of the Bring Back Our Girls campaign and bringing to light what was going on was that actually attracted international attention, and help did start coming. UNICEF, the UN has a huge presence there. Doctors Without Borders, who are really great because they're often very loud and say things that the government don't want them to say, but they're attracting attention. When I started going out there, there was a huge famine happening, a man-made famine. And so the UN was shouting as well. They needed more money. But it's a difficult situation. Not enough.
Not to be complete downers, there are some beautiful, hopeful parts of this documentary, which I think mean so much more, giving
and humor.
Given
they're funny.
What these girls have gone through, and I love that even after their 3 years, they were excited to go back to school and get an education. The very thing that they were taken for is the thing that they were excited to get back to.
Yeah, and what was really sad when I met the parents before we started filming with these girls, the parents were very accessible and easy to speak to, and a lot of them would say, if I hadn't sent my daughter to school, she would never have been kidnapped. And Nigeria, I think, I don't want to get the numbers wrong, but has one of the largest populations of children who are out of school. I think it's something like 13 million. And so education is really precious, and especially education for women. There's been a lot of work done to get women to go to school, and then something like this happens. And so, despite the fact that one of the Hanatu, she's scared to go back to school because it's so close to where Boko Haram is. I think the fact that they see the possibilities, that they can change their lives through an education, a good education, and they're surrounded now by very strong women, like the Minister of Women's Affairs, whether you like her or not in the film. She's, an incredible role model for them, because she would always say to them, you could be me. There's nothing stopping you, and you could be me one day. And it's all through, getting an education.
And to hear them speak about wanting to be a doctor or wanting to be, was really important for me to hear. Because you would think something like that would break their spirits, and the fact that they can still be so hopeful at least gives me inspiration to speak for them, and make sure people know their story.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's go to the audience really quick for a couple of questions.
Hi.
Hey.
I was wondering, going into this documentary, was there anything that you didn't know beforehand that you learned throughout the process of making it?
Well, so before I go anywhere, I do quite a lot of research and speak to a lot of people. So I had a pretty clear. I also have other friends who are photojournalists who'd work there, so I had a pretty clear idea of what the situation was when I was heading out there. I think what I didn't know was the story of the men, which unfortunately isn't in the film. There's an amazing group of women living in a refugee camp who are trying to advocate to get their men released out of military detention, because a lot of them who come out of the forest are accused of being Boko Haram, but often the men are kidnapped in a similar way to the girls and are not. And so one of the other problems that we're facing, aside from a famine, a war, etc., is the fact that you've got a huge female population without men, and in a place like northern Nigeria, that is not a great situation to be in.
This creates more instability.
Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah.
Next question.
Hi. So obviously this is a very powerful film. If nothing else, what is the one takeaway or lesson you want audiences to get from this?
I think what's really amazing is to be able to give a voice to a group of women. Often women are used as weapons in war, and I feel like, I think the takeaway, although it is a very sad film, I think I'd want the audience to feel that there is a really amazing, out of every crisis, there's an amazing side to humanity. And I think that through these women, there's also a lot of hope and strength. And, you know, just kind of a reality check. Like, we all have our own problems. We all, you know, feel like our problem is the worst thing in the world, and often it is. But you know, sometimes just seeing what these girls go through and how they survive, I think that's inspiring. So
it put a lot of things into perspective for me, 100%. And it made me want to look at young girls' education more seriously, even in our own communities, and just making sure that I can do what I can do to help girls in my community get an education, because it is something that we should not take for granted, obviously. And last question.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much for being here. And I'm wondering about the actual production of making this and sort of like the fears or challenges you came across as a producer in just trying to get this made. Maybe in terms of like safety or access or any of those things that you'd like to comment on? Yeah, so again, Maiduguri is considered it's a war zone, and working there is quite risky. It's not, you know, it doesn't have a front line. There isn't like a battle line, but the fear is kind of, you know, these suicide bombs that enter the city, and you just never know when it's going to happen. And so that's quite difficult, because as a producer, I'm eager to, you know, find the best characters, do original journalism, and find new things that we didn't know about. And my movements were very restricted in doing this, making this film. And, you know, with access, it requires a lot of patience, and, you know, it can be quite frustrating at times. And so you just have to persist in doing that, you know. And the government was quite open. I think I met the right person at the right time. And so that it wasn't easy, but it helped. But yeah, I think the hardest bit was, as from a producer's point of view, was how difficult it was to operate in Maiduguri, and me wanting to do more, and I couldn't. But I feel like, you know, I have, the two women, the forgotten girls, their story is incredible, and it's amazing that they had the courage to tell their story, because we're not showing this film in Nigeria, you know, for their own protection, because they are stigmatized by the community. But they were very eager for the rest of the world to hear their story. They really want the international community to hear their story.
And I think the rest of the world needs to hear their story, and also needs to remember not to forget that there are still thousands of women in captivity, and they every day are at risk. So I think
it's not going to end anytime soon.
Yeah. So it's not just, we shouldn't just be looking at the headlines, just really paying attention to the stories.
Yeah.
So I want to thank you for joining us. If you guys want to check out Stolen Daughters Kidnapped by Boko Haram, it premieres Monday, October 22nd at 8 p.m. Eastern on HBO. Please give it up for Sasha. Thank you.
Thank you.